Greetings. What's up, everybody? Welcome to tonight's discussion. Hopefully, it's a discussion. Hopefully, you guys will join us. We're live on Facebook and on YouTube, and slowly but surely getting videos out on our personal channel. If you don't know me, my name is Antoine. I don't know how you wouldn't know me if you're here live, but maybe you'll look at this later. If you don't know me, my name is Antoine Malone. I do a lot of conversation around Christianity. Race relationships, bringing the gospel to racial conflict, as well as serving young adults, and just in general thinking about the church and how it interfaces with our current context culturally. So today, what we're going to do, if you've seen some of the things I've done in the past, what you're going to have seen is that I've talked a lot about critical race theory and how it plays out. And so here recently, we have a new book that has come out by Jim Denison, and we'll get to him and that in just a second. Let me say this on the front end of things, because I know this conversation is really polarizing and people really fly to the edges of the conversation. So let me say this: I am not a critical race theory apologist, if you will. I don't think that everything about critical race theory is great. I think there are some issues that we should deal with in critical race theory. But what I do want to have is conversations that have integrity. And I do find that if we're going to defeat, if you will, if there's some aspect of critical race theory that needs to be defeated, it should be defeated head on and with integrity. In other words, what I'm not going to do is take something and mischaracterize it and make it to be something else in order to defeat it. Some people will call that straw manning. There's a whole number of ways that happens. It's not even straw manning. And what I find in a critical race theory conversation is you lose your credibility in critiquing critical race theory when you don't bring to the conversation what critical race theory really is about. And you lose credibility, you lose legitimacy when you talk about an idea and try to change and reshape that idea so that you can defeat it. Anyone who's intellectually has any intellectual prowess will recognize when someone takes an idea and shifts it and changes it in order to try to combat it or defeat it. And what I find in critical race theory, especially where it pertains to Christians and fundamentalist Christians and various types of Christians who kind of really push back heavily against critical race theory, I find that what happens is critical race theory is not being talked about as it is being reshaped and reformed into something else and then attacked from a different point of view. And so most of my videos come in, try to bring integrity to the argument, if you will, to the conversation around critical race theory, to say this is what it actually is. And if there are things that we need to combat it, then we can do so looking at it for what it is and not trying to change it and shift it and turn it or move it into a space that we're more comfortable with, when in reality, that's not the space it ever was designed to deal with. And so, again, I see that a lot in Christianity with Christian pastors. And so I come out and I speak out against that. So today we have I think we have Jim Denison, and his book is called Becoming Tsunami. And if you want to pick it up, I think it's a timely book. It is addressing some of the biggest cultural conversations we're currently having. Let me say about Jim Denison. Jim is, I've learned a lot from Jim. I've gotten a lot of, there's an email that he sends out on a daily basis at the Denison Forum. I recommend you go and check that out and maybe even sign up for it, where he comments regularly, daily, on things associated with Christianity and the culture. And I'm really appreciative of him for doing that. And again, have learned a lot from his words. I think Jim is a believer. I believe that he loves Jesus with all of his heart. And I believe he's pursuing his convictions. And so I don't have a problem with Jim at the moment, where he is. I do suspect that where it comes to critical race theory, him and I are going to be on different sides of this conversation. And I think that needs to be okay. That's okay. I'm not canceling Jim Denison. I'm not saying that he's a false prophet or saying that he's the worst thing ever. I think that we're going to look at what his words are from his book. We're going to read it together. And so I'm not going to mischaracterize him. I'm going to let his words speak for themselves. I'm going to comment on that. And my suspicion is that we're not going to be on the same page. And so we'll see. Maybe we are, but we're going to see. And what I want you guys to know is, because Jim and I are not on the same page on this issue, potentially, that doesn't mean that Jim is not a follower of Jesus and that he doesn't pursue God's things. It just means that we have a difference of opinion or different ideas around this area. And again, that's got to be okay. This isn't about slamming Jim Denison. And the reason we bring this book into the conversation is because Jim has a wide range of influence. And so because I care about the integrity of this conversation, I believe I don't have near as wide an influence as Jim, but I think with his influence being the way it is, providing a counter narrative to what he may be saying, I think can be helpful, because a lot of people trust Jim. And if he's incorrect, if he's incorrect, then there's another voice that maybe can offer a competing idea that will offer that correction. If you know Jim, and I know him loosely through some connections, I know him, he probably doesn't know me. I'd love to have a conversation with Jim privately or publicly. I'd actually prefer privately because, everybody kind of turns on for public conversations, and sometimes you're not talking to the person. But I'm open to a conversation because, again, I think that Jim Denison and I are going to land on different spaces on this issue. But again, I wish to reiterate, and I'm taking some time in the front here to do this. I wish to reiterate, because Jim and I may disagree on this, it doesn't mean that I am against Jim Denison's forms ministry and what he's doing. I think they're doing great work for the kingdom. I hope they continue to do it. And it doesn't mean that I think that he's not a gospel, and that he's left Christianity or some super nefarious things. There's got to be room for Christians to disagree, and Christian thought leaders to disagree. And again, it's okay for that to happen. So hopefully, this isn't about, as I said before, this isn't about me trying to slam Jim Denison. That all being said, the purpose of our time together is to read his words directly, right? To pull up some of the paragraphs that he's written about critical race theory and respond to them and to see, if we really are going to land in the same places, and offer some critical analysis of what he's saying in relationship to my understanding of critical race theory. All right. So with all of that having been done and said, what I took, that's 8 minutes. That's 8 minutes of disclaimers. That also gives you guys a little bit of time to get in here if you want to do this with me live. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop up the deal here, the screen. So hopefully you guys can read along. And what we're going to do, we're just going to read along with what he's doing, and then I'm going to respond to what he's saying. Now, this is his book. Again, the Coming Tsunami. So you should go and purchase the book. And I will, for context, let you know that just before this section where he says, what is critical race theory? Just before that section, there is a section on critical theory. We're not going to talk about that just because, again, it's his book, and I don't want to be reading his entire book, on this. So we're just going to read a section of it, and then I'm going to reply to what is written on the page there so that his thoughts have the full amount of integrity that they should have, and then my thoughts can flow into that. Let's see. What do we want to do here? All right, let's go ahead and begin. We're starting with what is critical race theory, right there in the middle. For purposes of this is the book. For purposes of brevity, I will confine my treatment to Bruce Ashford's excellent article in Public Discourse titled "Critical Race Theory: Plundering the Egyptians or Worshipping Baal." Ashford notes that legal scholar Derek Bell is usually considered the founding father of CRT. In his 1970 book, Race, Racism, and American Law, Bell argues that whites have always been racist and allow black rights only when it benefited whites to do so. In his 1987 book, And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice, he wrote even more explicitly, quote, progress in American race relations is largely a mirage, obscuring the fact that whites continue, consciously or unconsciously, to do all in their power to ensure their dominion and maintain their control, end quote. After other scholars, especially Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris, and Patricia Williams, built on Bell's work by analyzing the, quote, lived experience, end quote, of racial expression. Richard Delgado and John Stefanchik's reader, Critical Race Theory, encapsulates the primary tenets of CRT. These authors argue that racism is the everyday experience of Black Americans and other non-white races. The idea of, quote, race is a social construction that fostered a system of white ascendancy and continues to benefit the dominant group. Because whites are the beneficiaries of this prejudice system, they are incompetent to speak about race or racism. In addition, they are complicit in systemic racism to the degree that they participate uncritically in the system. All right, so he's written a few things there. Now, I have a few things to comment on that. I want a few things to comment on. So right at the top of the page there, and let's see, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but But right at the top of the page here, where he says, Bell argues that whites have always been racist and allowed black rights only when it benefited whites to do so, has been, he's not. Oops, I'm sorry. He's not saying whether he agreed with that or disagree with that, but that's the concept of entrance convergence, that if you've been in critical race theory conversations, you know that entrance convergence is what he's describing there. He doesn't label it here in the writing, but that's what he means. And so, okay, my issue is with the only here, and I'm not sure that it's an only. And even if it is only, I think if the word is only there, I think what we mean is that sort of predominantly. To say only is to say that whites are incapable, if you will, of doing something that doesn't benefit them, which isn't what I think Derek Bell was getting at, but I think it's where the conversation tends to go. When we talk about this particular statement, what many anti-CRT people or people who attack the idea come away from it, what they pull out of it is what you're saying is that white people are inherently and incapable, they're inherently prone to only pick, things that work in their benefit by their DNA. Like they can't choose any other thing. They're just that, right? And again, I don't think that is what he's saying. I think what he's saying is when you look over history, what his perspective is that every time it looked like Black people were making progress in the civil rights conversation, there was a win in it for white people that he felt factored heavily into the movement of that particular initiative. And that if that initiative wasn't there, then the movement toward the Black rights would have had less steam. What it isn't saying is that white people are inherently selfish, by their personal character, and that their DNA won't allow them to be anything other than that. That would be a racist statement to say that their DNA makes them such that they can only make decisions with that one criteria. But again, when people come and talk about critical race theory, that's how they typically take that statement and turn it. It would be a lot like saying most politicians make decisions based on whether it's going to help them get reelected. I think most of us may slip and say that about our politicians. What we're not saying when we make that statement over our lunches, what we're not saying is that a politician that they're unable to make a choice that doesn't lead to a positive prospect toward their next election. What we're saying is that the system is created in such a way, or at least the cultural expectation or the feelings that we've seen, or for some reason or another, we've grown to expect that if you're a politician, if you've made a decision, it likely doesn't hurt your political prospects, or definitely causes is a positive for your political prospects, right? And so we're not speaking to the politicians' inherent character, as it were, in the sense that they can or cannot do make decisions that don't work in their favor. But we're saying that culturally, it seems as though those sort of decisions get made that are congruous with their interest. So incongruous with their interest. So that's what that is. And so again, we it's said there, and it's, because it's not expanded upon, there's room for misinterpretation for that sentence. The other things that I want to talk about on this page, and again, we're going to get into some of this later, is this concept of consciously and unconsciously, which that stuff is fine. I don't need to break that stuff down. Suffice it is to say, this is a part of what critical race theory is suggesting. You can look at other videos to see how we deal with conscious and unconscious bias. What I do want to do is get down here to this paragraph here where Jim is saying here, he's sort of summing up a lot of the tenets. And again, he's not calling them that, but he's summing them up. And here he says, these authors argue that racism is the everyday experience of Black Americans and other non-white races. Now, again, there's room for misinterpretation here. While that is what the theory suggests, which is that racism is normal, what it doesn't mean is that racism is in everything that Black people experience. Some people will read this and they'll say, oh, so what you're saying is that Black people experience racism in every interaction of their life, right? And so everything that they do is laced or dealt with, is sort of corrupted or tinged with racism. That would be one way to read what he just wrote here. I don't know what Jim meant when he wrote it. I know that I can agree with this statement, but not on those terms. I agree with this statement in the sense that it's normal, meaning that it's not abnormal. What would be abnormal in these days would be for someone to come to my house and stick a cross in my yard and set it ablaze, right? Because that would be an extreme, abnormal, racist response. That's abnormal, right? And some people only think about racism in the abnormality space, only in the extreme space where a person is shot or a cross is burned in a yard, or an N-word or some sort of slur is uttered. And in those scenarios, those are extraordinary moments. Those are not ordinary, normal moments. Those are extreme anomalies to an otherwise orderly society. And what critical race theory is saying is, no, racism is more than those extraordinary abnormalities. Racism is also in everyday experiences. Is there? It doesn't say that it's in every one of them, but if you're looking for racism, you can look beyond the external extreme racist examples, and you can look into the normal spaces where people just interface with each other in normal ways. Racism is in the small things as well as the big things. It's in the extreme things, but it's also in the normal lane of things. And so what critical race theory is saying is, if we're going to talk about race, we can't just talk about the extraordinary things, the bigger things, the things that are on the outside, the very obvious things. We also have to include looking at the sort of normal way we live, the things that we interface with on an everyday basis, and see if racism resides there as well. Critical race theory would suggest that it does, but it does not say, and what it's not saying is that everything a Black person or non-white person does is dealt with by racists. Okay, so there's that. Again, so far though, no problem with what Jim has written here, just that it can lend itself to be misunderstood. The next thing he says here is the idea of race is a social construction. I think we all can agree with that. that certainly even from a Christian point of view, the Bible doesn't deal with race. It's certainly not in the external physical features way. We do have nations and biological race, if you will, or ethnic race or nations, but we don't have this physical determinant. And so it says the idea of race is a social construction. We agree with that, and that fostered a system of white ascendancy and continues to benefit the dominant group. We would agree that critical race theory does say that. Because whites are the beneficiaries of this prejudice system, they're incompetent to speak about race or racism. And so this statement right here is also typically associated with some sort of postmodernist feelings-based truth. Those who feel like they have to guard against the truth, what they're saying, they grab a statement like this. They say, so what you're saying is the only people who can tell us the truth about racism is Black people or people, non-white people. And again, that's not what the statement is necessarily saying. What the statement is saying is you have an incomplete analysis of what racism looks like in America without the voices of those who are actually on the receiving end of that racism. You're not going to be able to tell the full story about racism without people who have had acts of racism performed against them telling their story. And in that sense, white people or non-white people cannot provide the narrative or the perspective of a Black person who has experienced racism. If you take it out of racism and say you put it in pregnancy, a doctor can learn all there is to learn about pregnancy, about how babies are formed in the body, and maybe even what the body does when it gives birth. He can write the story on that. He can do his dissertation on that. But if he doesn't actually speak to a woman who has been pregnant and has given birth, then there's something missing in his report, because there's going to be something about giving birth that only a woman who gives birth can provide. Because he's never given birth, he can't provide that part of the story. He can't come in and say, hey, you know what? Giving birth feels like ... He can't do that because he has never done that. He's never given birth. And now let's move it back into the race space. The slave master and the slave can't talk about racism in the same way. The slave master can never give the perspective of what it means to live like a slave. He's not a slave. If you want to understand what racism feels like as a slave, you're going to have to ask a slave that. You're going to have to ask the person who's living that experience. If you don't ask them, you have incomplete data. It's all. And what critical race theory is suggesting here is, if we're going to understand race and the effects of race in the law, which is what critical race theory is meant to measure, then we've got to ask people who have been on the other side of racism to contribute. And the power structure didn't allow those voices to weigh in for a good amount of time. And so critical race theory is saying, hey, listen, we got to bring those voices in if we're going to really understand the situation we're in. What it's not saying is that white people have nothing to contribute and that the only truth about the situation comes from Blacks. It means that it just means that the non-white experience needs to be included in the conversation when you have a conversation about racism, right? And if you don't have that voice, then you can't be properly critical, if you will. You can't make a proper evaluation of what things are if you don't have that voice in the room. That's all this is talking about. Again, many people will take this statement and make it seem as though white people shouldn't have anything to say ever at all. And that's not what the tenet is talking about. Okay, and then the next sentence here says, in addition, sorry, I'm still learning how to use this. In addition, they are complicit in systemic racism to the degree that they participate uncritically in a system. This is about silence. I don't know that CRT is that a feature of CRT is the concept that silence is complicity. That may be outside the scope of what CRT is. That may be a part of the conversation around race culturally, but I don't know that fits under the CRT umbrella. But potentially, it's not one of the major tenets. And it's kind of an outside voice, if you will, to that. So I don't know that I connect that silent complicity to CRT, but again, I do recognize that that's part of the race conversation. All right, let's continue to read here. It says, whites are therefore encouraged to participate critically in the public square by exposing the racial disparities that prevail in our nation's policing, sentencing, and incarceration. They're also encouraged to advocate for minorities' voting rights by eliminating gerrymandering and redlining, denying services to residents of certain areas based on their race or ethnicity, and by using legislation or social pressure to change speech norms that perpetuate racism. Okay, agree with all of that. CRT finds many supporters in the Black intellectual community, but many prominent Black thinkers reject it as a flawed theory, such as economist Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, Glenn Larry, political scientist Carol M. Swain, and Wilfred Riley, political commentators and activists Derek Green and Alveda King, public intellectual Coleman Hughes, and elected official Tim Scott. They work to establish justice and promote activism, but believe that CRT actually perpetuates racism and harms society. Yeah, again, I think that's true of those people, and it's true of what they think about CRT. In addition, many Christians acknowledge that CRT can be a useful tool for analyzing power dynamics, but ultimately reject it as a worldview as fundamentally incompatible with the Christian faith. Okay, this is true that Christians think that, and I think that's a problem because critical race theory is not a worldview. It is a system of evaluation with its target being the law and the racial effect of the law on society. That's not a worldview. That's a process of thinking. That's an evaluative process. Rejected as a worldview as fundamentally incompatible with the Christian faith. In their view, it functions as a form of intellectual idolatry. Okay, so we get our first sort of, and thus should be rejected. So what he's saying is that many Christians acknowledge that CRT can be useful for some analyzing of power dynamics, but ultimately reject it as intellectual idolatry. I don't know about that. I don't know that I've heard any Christian person who hold those two views together, that they hold that it's an analytical tool, but intellectual idolatry. In fact, intellectual idolatry is new to me in this conversation. I will say that before something like critical race theory came through, the idea around race had been one where if you were Black and you called something race related, you were accused of being too emotional or being too irrational, that you didn't have any real data to prove what it was that you were suggesting, and that you wasn't thinking, but you were feeling. And why don't you come with some proof, or how do you know that, or you can't prove that, or those are the things that were coming. And so now critical race theory comes, and there is a thought through way to have the conversation. And it is a little troubling that now that there is a thought through way to have the conversation, it's being called idolatry, intellectual idolatry, when in reality, I think it is just an intellectual response, whether you agree with it or don't. Intellectual idolatry seems like an overstatement, to say the least. But again, Jim isn't saying that's where he is. He's saying this is where many Christians are. Okay, so Ashford, the guy who he's citing, and I think because he's citing him, we can assume that Jim is in agreement with Ashford on this. Otherwise, he wouldn't cite him. But the book doesn't say I agree with Ashford. But he is writing these things here. So let's look at these. Let's look at these things here. These four reasons why it should be rejected as intellectual idolatry instead of something that's useful. Middle column, number 1, CRT identifies racism as the result of the West's historic cultural system rather than the corruption of the individual's heart. Pause. So here's where we have the issue. So this is the argument that sin resides in the heart of individuals, not systems. And since CRT is saying that a system is racist, then it's incompatible with Christianity, because Christianity doesn't locate sin in systems, it locates sins in individuals. I can't talk. It locates sin in individuals. What I would say to that is, Both of those things are true. It's not one or the other. And I would also say that we need to understand the scope of what critical race theory is actually trying to do. What does critical race theory want to do? What it wants to do is evaluate laws. Laws by themselves are a system. They're a part of the system. A collection of laws create a system. So the focal point of critical race theory is systems, is to evaluate the system. It's not commenting on or commentating on the individual's actions. And when it does, it's only commenting on that in relation to how that action affects how the system is created by those individuals. But the scope of critical race theory is the law. Here's a picture that I hope will be clear. I've done this a lot, and maybe this is the best picture I can come up with. When you go to a job, you get an employee handbook, right? Everybody gets an employee handbook. Inside the employee handbook is a list of policies and procedures that everybody has to go through and follow. This is your rules. This is your system, if you will, the employee handbook. And then you also go and you meet who you work with. You meet your coworkers, you meet your boss, you meet all of those sorts of things. Now, let's say promotions is what someone's going to come in and they're going to judge whether discrimination is happening with promotions. But what they decide to do is, instead of touring all of the employees to determine whether they have racial bias in them to see, or whether they have some sort of discriminatory bias in their character, what they're going to do is say, hey, bring us the handbook. What we want to do is we want to look at the employee handbook to see if there's some sort of process in here that is discriminatory. And let's say you open up that handbook and there's a line in there that says, do not promote women. It's written in the handbook. Do not promote women. Women are not to be promoted, but are to stay in the role that they were hired in, right? Period. Let's say some really jacked up employee handbook had that written into it. Well, critical race theory would go to that employee handbook and say, hey, this law that this guideline that you have inside of your handbook, that's discriminatory. That thing is discriminatory. That's a discriminatory practice. You need to take that out of your handbook if you don't want to be known as a discriminatory environment. Now, there's no person associated with that line. Well, I guess you could say whoever wrote it, but what's in action is, if somebody wanted to promote a woman, they couldn't do it. They wouldn't be able to do it because the employee handbook is saying, the system is saying, the law of this corporate entity is saying that they cannot do it, right? And what critical race theory is doing is saying, hey, let's look at the handbook of America, right? And let's just comb through there and make sure that there's nothing in here that is discriminatory in the handbook. Sure, there may be some guy who's the boss who has a personal idea about women, and therefore that guy also thinks women shouldn't be promoted, and he himself acts discriminatorily. Sure, that's fine. That would happen. But if someone's coming in to measure the handbook, they're not asking about that guy. They're not making a comment. They're not making an evaluation on him. He may exist, but the scope of that investigation is to deal with the handbook, right? Also, to say that you're dealing with the handbook is not to say that person over here can't be discriminatory on their own. It should be very clear to see. CRT is designed to look at the handbook and to say, does the handbook produce the outcome that this corporate culture wants to produce? If it's not written, if there's something written in the handbook that produces discrimination, well, certainly we want to get that out of the handbook. You know, it's very simple. It's not complicated to do that. It's a very simple concept. So when you read this, number one, CRT identifies racism as the result of West's historical cultural system rather than the corruption of the individual's heart. Well, the problem with the statement is this word, rather. CRT isn't even dealing with the individual's heart. That's not even the purpose of its That's not the scope of its inquiry. The scope of its inquiry is the historical cultural system, and not just historical, but the modern cultural system. And so when you put this rather in here, where you make one versus the other, and you start to put critical race theory in a field that is not meant to deal with. We keep reading. I'm sorry, I got all these. I don't know how to get rid of that. Okay, I keep highlighting things on the screen that I want to get rid of. And so that's the first problem with number one. The first problem with number one is false. It's a false accusation. Scripturally, let me keep reading because I think it gets here. So let me keep reading. According to CRT, each white citizen is implicated as a racist, whether or not he or she is personally prejudiced. The solution is to change the system and produce equity for all. Okay, everything's wrong with that sentence, paragraph. Literally everything's wrong with this paragraph. CRT does not say that all white people are racist in the way that you're thinking about racist. The way you may be thinking about racist is burn the cross, N-word, call you less than me, racist. What it's saying is, as a system, since racism is a part of the system, let me calm down a little bit. Since racism is part of the system, there's a greenhouse. Think about it this way. There's a greenhouse that produces racism in it. And we're all living in that greenhouse. That's not the best example. It's more like we've created a pool and we're all swimming in the pool, so we can't help but be wet, right? Like the pool has racism in it. And society has been built with these racist, CRT is suggesting these sort of racist things threaded in its initial formulation of society, that is all around us, that we can't help but be affected by it, that we can't help but see the world a little bit through a sort of white, if you will, lens. And so the problem with the statement is that it leaves out the other citizens. The reality is what CRT is suggesting is that every citizen in America is implicated as a kind of racist, if you will. All of us, because we live in a city, live in an American context that has white as that has the whiteness threaded inside of it. All of us now see the world sort of through a white lens. It's kind of like, since white has become normal, we have to adjust to normal. And so therefore we start making judgments and things about people and things in a sort of white kind of way. Now, let me deal with this white thing because it could be tripping you up. Now, remember, previously we talked about white as a social construct. That's what it said on the page just before this. So whiteness is not skin color. Whiteness is a category of ideas. It's a kind of normalcy. It's a category. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of doing. It's an established practice of norms. It's a way to see the world. Whiteness is closer to a worldview than CRT is. And so when you say, hey, you grew up in whiteness, you grew up seeing the world in a certain kind of way, right? And so when this says each white citizen, it's probably talking about white skin color. But in reality, what CRT is talking about is this sort of white way of seeing the world, right? This sort of, we're all dabbling in the bucket of the same sort of white, if you will, ideas. Now, let me say this. Whiteness, sort of categorically, do I have time for that? I may not have time to get into that. I don't have time to get into that. I see we're at 38 minutes and I don't know if I'm gonna make it. So suffice it is to say, when you see the word white, think about, sometimes that's referring to skin color, sometimes that's referring to a way of seeing society, right? A white way of seeing society. And what I'm saying is CRT is saying that because we live in an America that has centered whiteness, we're all used to viewing our society through a white lens. And that makes us prone to racist, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not. And therefore the system, and okay, so that's that. And that's why it says whether or not he or she is personally prejudiced. It's because it's not always about the value of the individual. It's about the way you see society, which can, in fact, create a prejudiced view of individuals. Then the last thing, the solution is to change the system and produce equity for all. The solution is to adjust the system. So adjust is better than change. But and produce equity for all. You say equity with what? Now, equity brings in the other bomb to the conversation. So first we got derailed by the fact that it's systems versus individuals, and you lose your mind over that. I tried to explain that to you so that it could be more clear. This equity conversation starts to bring in money and resources in many people's minds. Let me free you from that. Critical race theory is not trying to produce equitable money and resources. What they're trying to produce is equitable opportunities and equitable experiences under the American legal system. The opportunities and the experiences need to be equitable. So what this should say is the solution is to change the system and produce equitable opportunities and experiences for all. To add that qualifier keeps the money and the resource conversation out of it, which if you don't do that, the money and the resource conversation is in it. And now you start to deal with communism, socialism, and Marxism, and which is exactly where this always tends to go. That the conversation somehow means that CRT wants everybody to live in the same house and have the same amount of food and have the same this, that, and the other, that everything needs to be exactly the same. That's not the goal of CRT. What is the goal is that everyone have the same experiences, that they have the same opportunities, that their rights are not infringed upon because of their color, the color of their skin, or that their opportunities are not limited because of the color of their skin. Their experiences in life as they interface with the police or with other people or with the store or with the merchant or with the mortgage lender, that those experiences are not tainted because of the color of the skin. We want equitable opportunities, equitable experiences. It's not about everybody having the same money. There is a side effect. There's a money side effect to all this, but the end game is not about money. It's about experiences and opportunities. Once again, a completely missed aspect of CRT because I think people are scared about money. Okay, let's keep going. According to scripture, sin is an individual's rebellion against God's word and will. True. Critical race theory is not dealing with that. Doesn't speak to that. First of all, critical race theory is not even dealing with sin. When do we bring the religious language of sin in? Right? You say, well, you brought sin in because racism is a sin. Okay, but critical race theory is not trying to solve the sin problem. He's trying to solve the very specific racial language in the handbook, right? And it's not trying to change the hearts of individuals. It doesn't comment on this religious. And so here we are. We'll have to bring this religious piece in. CRT, again, the scope of critical race theory is the law, not religion. Now we're about to bring this religious stuff in. According to scripture, sin is an individual's rebellion against God's word and will. Sure, I agree with that. Critical race theory is neutral about that. Doesn't say anything about that. Racism thus occurs when a person thinks, feels, acts, or speaks in a prejudiced manner toward another person merely because of that person's ethnicity. Racism, first and foremost, is a movement of the will. Sure, that's where it starts. But racism in an individual leads to the writing of a law that says black people and white people can't drink from the same fountain. And if the society decides, you know what, our hearts have been changed, we now believe that it is totally okay for black people and white people to drink from the same fountain, but nobody goes and actually changes the letter of the law, then the law stays in effect. And even the will of our hearts doesn't come reality because the handbook is in the way. So let's go to the handbook, take the law out of the handbook, and then we get to have this product of the changed heart that you're talking about. The two things work together. CRT has helped. Oh, sorry about that. CRT is helpful in exposing the degree to which individual sins can become incarnated in social structures and institutions, but CRT fails to note that individual repentance is essential to changing lives and social structures. Well, that's because CRT's goal is not to deal with, and I've said it ad nauseum, CRT's goal is not to deal with the individual. You should not expect a law theory from Harvard to tell individuals to repent to God. It's not the scope. It's not what they're trying to do. They're neutral about that. It's not, they're silent about that. CRT isn't supposed to deal with that. It's beyond the scope of what they're trying to do. Do you understand? Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? You're asking to do something that it's not trying to do. It's not speaking to that. It's just not speaking to that. Okay, number 2, CRT claims that color blindness is impossible, so it promotes treating people differently on the basis of their ethnic heritage in order to privilege the oppressed and oppress the oppressor. Wrong, man. So yeah, we're here. We're at it. So so CRT does claim that color blindness is impossible because you cannot not notice my skin color. So unless you're colorblind, like literally clinically colorblind. I think what people think about when they say color blindness is that they don't ascribe some sort of value to the individual. But what CRT is claiming is like, no, you're going to see a black person and you're going to respond to that black person as you've been trained to respond to them, whether you like it or not. And so don't act like you don't see a black person. That person's a black person. When you get home and you say, hey, honey, I met somebody new today, you're likely going to say that they were black or brown or whatever, or Mexican. You're gonna tell them what they look like. That's just common sense. So it promotes treating people differently based on ethnic heritage. So here, treating people differently implies some sort of discrimination. I think what critical race theory is saying that is, it's not asking, again, we want equitable experiences. I say we. I'm not necessarily a critical race theorist, but this is part of the critical race theory I do agree with. We want equitable experiences. So it doesn't make sense to ask for equitable experiences, but then ask to be treated differently to be treated differently qualitatively on race. I think what this is saying is we want to treat people appropriately, if we could say it in a more technical way, culturally intelligently in connection to their ethnic heritage. In other words, I might treat in a small group, we do this all the time in small groups, and in a small group context, a lot of my Asian brothers and sisters in Christ have grown up in such a context where they don't really speak until they're spoken to. And so in a general small group context, you may ask a question to the room. Hey, everybody, this is what, let's get some ideas about XYZ, right? And so everybody tries to jump in and give their idea. And then there's my Asian brother, and he's quiet. And we say, hey, do you have any thoughts? Right. And then he answers, and we get to him. We say, hey, man, well, what is it? Why is it that you just don't share that up front? And then when he enlightens us, say, hey, my culture is that, normally, for whatever reasons, my culture dictates that I don't really talk until I'm spoken to in a context like this, in a teaching context like this. Now, me as a leader, now that I understand that cultural context, I might treat that person differently. You see that? Because now I'm like, okay, that person might need me to prompt them to speak. That's an example of treating differently. That's not, hey, we're not going to let you have the job, treat differently. That's not, hey, you're not good enough, treat differently. That's understanding the cultural sensitivity of each person's ethnic tradition and heritage and adjusting my way of interfacing with that person in light of their ethnic heritage. That's all that is. And so when it says treating people differently, don't let it mean discrimination. He may actually mean it. In fact, the person that wrote this probably meant it as discrimination. That's not what CRT is actually suggesting. Okay. In order to privilege the oppressed and oppress the oppressor. Oh, yeah, I definitely don't have time to get into the power dynamics. Maybe we'll do a part 2. I'm not going to do a full hour. I'm not going to be on an hour, and I know we got two more things to get to. Let's just get to the end of this before we get to 3, and then we'll see what maybe I'll decide what I do. So the top paragraph here in the third column, as Black sociologist George Yancey notes, this approach tends to ignore sins committed by minorities, which disempowers them by eliminating them of responsibility while alienating whites. By contrast, God's word applies to each of us based on our role and calling rather than our class or structural status. So this last paragraph is speaking to this concept that, again, it's really should have been part of the last paragraph. This concept that by CRT looking at the law, it's excusing personal behavior. CRT is not excusing personal behavior. It's just not speaking at all about personal behavior because it's not the subject. It's not the subject. The subject is the law, the handbook, not the employees. We're looking at the handbook. And somebody's like, well, what about the employees? Well, somebody else is going to come in and do an inquiry about the employees. There may be problems over there, but we're looking at the handbook. And this is a presumptive to presume, and I don't know who George, I do know who George Yancey is, but I just disagree with him. By looking at the laws and making sure that they're not discriminatory, we're not eliminating the effect of personal responsibility. Neither are we saying that people are no longer responsible for their choices. Sure, those things exist over there. These are two different conversations that don't need to be pitted against each other as either or. Let's see where we're at. 51 minutes. Maybe we'll, in order to privilege the oppressed and the oppressor, there's a lot to talk about with this oppressed and oppressor language. Let's get into this oppressed and oppressor language. Yeah, okay, we'll spend the last bit of our time today dealing with this oppressed and oppressor language. Oppressed and oppressor, the language itself is meant to trigger your anti-Marxian instincts. I'm not here to be pro-Marxian. Let's talk about oppression. Let's stack a series of, I wish I had a graphic. Let's stack a series of dominoes, right? With the Christian worldview in mind. Let's start with the first domino. The first domino is power. Let's talk about power. Power in a society is inevitable. There's no society that exists where everyone who is a part of that society has the same amount of influence and power. There's no such place. Even in heaven, God is the king. He has more power than we will have when we get to heaven. There's no society where power is not a dynamic. That's inevitable, unchangeable. Send me an email of a society that has a civilization that doesn't have a breakdown between influence. So if we can agree that power is an inevitable of any society, then that means that we have a natural breakup of the influencers and those who have more influence than other people. There's some people who can change things, and there's some people who are the subjects that have to deal with change. There's some people who can move things, who can establish things, who can bring things to be. They can their power. They have influence. They have power. And there's other people who don't have that same level of power. So power exists, and as a result of power existing, there is a stratosphere of power as a result of that. Then not everybody has the same one, so therefore there is not power equity. There is power differential. There's power disparity. That every society has a disparity of power. Let's just settle with that. Okay. So if so far you're with me, power exists inevitably. Because of inevitable power shifts, No situation has shared power equally, socially, right? But there's a stratosphere. Okay, now let's throw the Christian view in to say, hey, we're all totally depraved, sinners by nature, self-interested and selfish by our very nature. Then those who have the power to serve their interests are likely to serve their own interests at the expense of or irregardless to the means of or thoughts of those who do not. Power exists inevitably. Stratosphere of power is inevitable in every society. We are all sinners, self-interested. Therefore, if I have the power to to produce my own self-interest, to advance my own self-interest, then I will do that, even if it means oppressing or taking away from those who are beneath me. Now, that's the part you're like, no, that doesn't necessarily mean that. Well, then what you're saying is that those who have power have some innate non-sin in their nature. Something about those who have power who just are not self-interested at all. They're just, they think about everybody. They make decisions that have everyone in mind. Well, no, number one, that's not the way we think we act. And number two, it sounds like that's not even what we want people to do. Certainly in America, most people are just like, look, I don't want to think about everybody. I want to just think about me. Right? So if there's a power differential, and because of that power differential, there's a space where people have in them the sin of self-interest and greed and selfishness and self-advancement, then they're going to exercise whatever power influence they have in their possession to pursue their own interests. That formula creates an oppressor and oppressive, an oppressed and oppressor dynamic. I would make the case, let's say not oppressor and oppressed. What it creates is, well, yeah, I think it does. If we're going to add sin to power, then you create oppress and oppression. Now, again, you got to stay away from the extreme versions of oppress and oppressor, because when you think about oppress and oppressor, you might be thinking about Saddam Hussein, or you might be thinking about Osama bin Laden, or you might be thinking about Adolf Hitler, or some some tyrannical version. But if you live in a space where there's power differential and we're all selfish and greedy, then that means that every person is working to their own best interests at the expense of their neighbor's best interest, which creates a me versus you, survival of the fittest scenario. Well, yes, that means that the strong is at the top and the weaker at the bottom, or the powerful is at the top and the powerless is at the bottom, or the oppressor is at the top or the oppressed is at the bottom. Now, these are neutral terms. You don't have to be angry about that. That's just the way society is. So the challenge is not to say, man, we don't live in a power society, because we do. And the challenge is not to say that we're prone to oppression, because we are. The Bible tells us that. That's what the scriptures reveal to us about ourselves, is that we're sinners and that we're selfish interested by nature. Some people say insufferably so, that there's no way for us to not be that. And if that's the case, then that means societies are prone to have varying levels of oppression and oppressor groups in them. So we need not be concerned and alarmed by the presence of that dynamic in our society, even as Christians. If you follow the formula, it's what you would expect if the Bible is true. Now the question comes, what do we do with that power? What happens when the change of the heart happens in the individual, and suddenly those who have power are no longer interested in furthering their own best interests, but they actually are interested in taking care of the other person, thinking collectively. What happens when that happens? And the scriptures they tell us that we ought to care for the other. Like that the product of a changed heart is a change of the direction of our motive, certainly socially. So that now that you have a system where power differential is real, you can't avoid it. Some people are going to have more power than others, but like Jesus said to the disciples, but the powerful don't lord their power over those who they have power over, but instead they serve. That's what the scripture says. And that the first becomes last and the last becomes first. And suddenly the thing that happens with power doesn't have to be oppressive. It could be service. In fact, it turns out that the person who has the most power has the most opportunity to serve, to be a blessing to others. That's what the scripture is teaching us. The scripture is teaching us to lay down our self-interest and pick up the interest of our neighbor, of the other, right? So when critical race theory comes and says, hey, we live in a system that has oppressed and oppressor, you don't need to go back to Karl Marx and be like, hey, Karl Marx was the inventor of the concept of oppressed and oppressor. No, you don't even need Karl Marx. Just look at the scriptures themselves and follow the dominoes to say, we are born as sinners. We collect each other. Power dynamics are a feature of society, of every society. And as a feature of every society, and the fact that we're sinner, we're likely to create a system that holds some people down in order to prop those up who have power, because that is what serves the interest of the powerful. And without Christ, that is the system that we're in. That is the natural, predictable outcome of a Christless system. And then Christian comes in and says, okay, we can't change the power dynamic. We can't change this. So what we want to do is change the heart direction of the people who are making the laws, who have the power, to make sure that they cover everyone. And this is what has made America great, because America is the closest we've gotten to that, at least on the it's the closest we've gotten to it, at least on paper, from Constitution, once we got the Civil Rights Act stuff going, right? Starting in the 60s. It's the closest thing we got to understanding that, hey, there is a power differential, but we're going to try to spread that out so that every voice matters in a democracy, and that everyone gets to speak into what happens. And the chief among us are going to be those who represent us, not themselves. The Senate, the U.S. representatives, and their job, they're given their power not to pursue their own ideas, but to pursue the ideas of the constituency with which they represent. And therefore, their power is in service to others, not their own individual selves. So America is set up to be close to pull this thing off. And so people like me are looking at it like, man, there's a great opportunity for us to do this, and we're missing it. And this concept of oppressed and oppressor has gotten in the way because people immediately associate oppressed with Marx and Marxism. And next thing you know, we're down the rabbit trail of communism, which is an unnecessary feature of the conversation. We need not do that. Oppressed and oppressor is a biblical concept that is the product of sin, collective sin, in a civilization where power dynamics are existent and sin is inevitable. Okay, so we'll have to come back and do 3 and 4. I really do want to do it. I see us talking about this priesthood and all this that looks like crazy. So maybe we'll tackle that tomorrow. Daryl, I see you. This is a book that I see your comment about sending you a link to the article. This isn't an article. What this is Jim Denison has written a book called The Coming Tsunami, and he's dealing with 4 different categories of conversation around cultural discourse. One of those is critical race theory, or critical theory, and therefore critical race theory. And this is a little bit of the section that he wrote in that book. So if you want to pick up the book, you can pick up the book and read the rest of it. He deals with multiple things, and there's a lot in the book that's good, but I'm just responding to this critical race theory bit right here. It's called Coming Tsunami. Anyone else? I know we didn't have, let's see, where am I? I didn't have a lot of comments, but that's fine. I was just kind of doing my thing. Feel free to jump in the comment section and share what you're thinking about some of the things that we read. Maybe there's something that I missed, maybe something that I mischaracterized. If you got questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. Be respectful to each other, have quality conversations without, you can disagree without demonizing. This is a place where I want that to be true in the comment section of wherever it is that you're watching this. Maybe tomorrow or sometime we'll get through the last 2. It'll be a shorter video. Until then, you guys have a blessed day, and I will see you when I see you.